Before I record any story for any platform, Alexandra Ignatovic, or Sandra for short, was born in 1967 in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, Canada. Her parents, who had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, were both extremely hardworking people who also had big, warm personalities and great senses of humor. They would pass all three of those qualities on to their daughter, which in turn made her a very popular person from a young age. In addition to her attractive personality, Sandra was also considered very physically attractive, so much so that when she was a teenager, her friends began to encourage her to compete in beauty pageants. Sandra was always flattered by these remarks, but would laugh them off, saying she didn't belong in something like that. But in 1985, during Sandra's senior year of high school, she finally gave in to her friends' suggestions and entered a local beauty contest called the Miss Burnaby pageant. And much to her shock, but not to her friends, she would win. And this win would automatically enter her into the huge Miss Canada beauty competition that year, though she would lose that one. However, Sandra was not remotely fazed by the loss. She actually thought it was pretty funny that she had gotten as far as she had. After high school, Sandra lived at home with her parents and attended a technical school to become a dental assistant. During this time, Sandra and her mom, Stange, who she was very close with, developed a hobby that they did together on the weekends. On nice days, they would find local open houses, and they would pretend to be in the market for buying a home, when in reality, they just wanted to walk around the property and fantasize about what it would be like to live there. In 1987, when Sandra was 21 years old and was now working full-time as a dental assistant but still living at home, she and her mother, like usual, went to an open house one weekend in their neighborhood, and once they arrived, it was very crowded, and so they made their way off to the side and just began chatting in their family's native tongue, Serbo-Croatian. And so as they're doing this, a woman they didn't recognize walks up to them. She was this short, older woman with rosy cheeks who was grinning ear to ear, and when she reached the mother and daughter, she very excitedly began speaking in Serbo-Croatian as well. She said her name was Jelka Pesek, and she couldn't help but overhear them speaking in her native tongue. Like Sandra's parents, Jelka had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, and like Sandra and her mom, Jelka was at this open house pretending to be in the market for a home when really she was just fantasizing same as they were. So these commonalities they shared immediately put them all at ease, and before long, all three of them were chatting and laughing like they were old friends. Over the course of their 15 or so minute-long conversation, Jelka eventually asked Sandra pretty point blank if she was single or in a relationship. And Sandra, who was a little caught off guard by the abrupt question, said, "I'm single." At which point, Jelka lit up, and with a smile on her face, she said, "Well, I'd love for you to meet my son Joe. He's about your age and single too." Sandra smiled, but before she could respond, Jelka kind of waved her off like she knew she was being too pushy, and she just said, "Look, our family owns an automotive shop in town. It's called Sam & Sons. If either of you ever have car troubles, it's on the house. Bring your car in. And if you, Sandra, swing by, I'll introduce you to Joe." Then she handed Sandra a business card and said her goodbyes to both of them and then turned and walked away. Once she was gone, Sandra and her mother kind of chuckled about the conversation they had just had, and then they went back to just enjoying the open house. And by that evening, when the mother and daughter had gotten back to their own home, they had more or less forgotten about Jelka. However, the following day, while Sandra was out running some errands, her car's engine started making really loud knocking sounds. While she didn't know what they meant, she knew that she really needed to have someone look at her car, and so as she began to look around, wondering if an auto body shop just happened to be close to her, she remembered Jelka from the day before giving her that business card for her auto body shop, and so Sandra pulled over to the side of the road, she fished inside of her purse, and she pulled out that card, the business card, and she saw the address of the auto body shop was only a couple of blocks away, and so she merged back onto the road and she began driving over. When she arrived outside of Sam & Sons auto body shop, she parked in their front lot, and then she got out and she made her way into the front office, and then as soon as she stepped inside, she saw right ahead of her was this big desk, and behind the desk was Jelka. And as soon as Jelka saw Sandra coming in, Jelka lit up and she said, "Oh my goodness, you're here. Come here. I got to introduce you to my son." And that's when Sandra said, "Well, actually, I'm here because my car actually broke down today. And I was wondering if, you could have a look at it." And immediately Jelka said, "Oh, of course." She grabbed a mechanic. She pulled him over and said, "Right now, go out and get Sandra's car. She has to be at the front of the line." And so the mechanic went out to get Sandra's car. And then Sandra said, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to just go step outside and just let me know when it's done." But Jelka would say, No. You have to meet my son. Hold on just a minute." And so Sandra just kind of stood in the waiting room, kind of feeling a little bit awkward, and Jelka ran back into the back room behind the desk, and then she came running back out a few minutes later, and just a few seconds behind her was this handsome man in a crisp suit who had short dark hair and a perfectly manicured mustache, and Jelka immediately grabbed him and kind of wheeled him out from behind the desk and brought him right in front of Sandra, and with a huge grin on her face, she says to Sandra, "This is Joe, this is my son. He's single, you're single, you two should go on a date." And so Sandra and Joe immediately laughed because it was so pushy and so forward, it was just kind of comical. But over the course of their very short interaction, they both found each other attractive and they actually agreed to meet up for a date. And over the course of the next few weeks, the pair would go on many dates and they would become inseparable. Joe would take Sandra to the nicest restaurants in town, they would go dancing, and then sometimes they'd just hop on Joe's motorcycle and go for long rides in the countryside. Less than a month after their first meeting, Sandra was already telling her family and friends that Joe might be the one. And she would be right, because almost exactly a month after their first meeting, Joe would ask Sandra to marry him, and she would say yes. Sandra was beyond excited. She knew this proposal had been abrupt, but she didn't care. She felt like Joe was perfect. However, there was one detail about Joe that Sandra hadn't really seen fully yet, and that was his mother. Sandra was aware that Jelka could be a bit pushy. After all, she did literally tell Sandra to date her son while they stood directly in front of her son. However, after that interaction, Sandra had really not spent much time around Jelka and so hadn't formed much of an opinion of her. But as soon as wedding preparations began, that would change. Jelka wanted to plan every single detail of the wedding. You should get married in this church. You should buy this gown from the store. Your bridesmaids should wear these dresses. Here's a great music list for the wedding reception. Although she presented these as suggestions, they were more like demands. At first, Sandra tried to just roll with it and allowed Jelka to have her way with a number of the decisions, but after each concession, it just seemed like Jelka would come back with even more demands. Finally, Sandra had just had enough, and she told Jelka, "You gotta stop inserting yourself into every single wedding planning decision. This is my wedding. This is Joe's wedding, not yours." And shockingly, Jelka responded by effectively saying, "I know better than you, and I'm not going to stop telling you how to have the best wedding because I want it to be the best." Sandra was dumbfounded. She felt like she literally could not stop Jelka, and so she went to her fiancé, and although she knew she was putting him in a really awkward situation, she told him he had to step in and tell his mom to back down, that she was totally overbearing and making this wedding process a nightmare. At first, Joe tried to act like Sandra was overreacting, but Sandra just was not having it, and she basically said, "I will postpone this wedding if you don't handle this." And so after a deep sigh, Joe told Sandra, "Okay, I'll go talk to my mom." And sure enough, Joe would. And Jelka would step back as a result of this conversation. However, it was plainly obvious that Jelka was not happy about this. And to show her displeasure, for the rest of the wedding planning cycle, Jelka refused to look at or talk to Sandra. But as upsetting as this was for Sandra, ultimately she was kind of okay with it because one, Joe had demonstrated that he could have her back when she really needed him, and two, she didn't really like talking to Jelka at this point. She found her incredibly annoying, and so to have Jelka ignoring her was kind of a good deal. A few weeks before their wedding, Sandra and Joe, who at that point both still lived with their parents, decided to go out and get an apartment they could share together as a couple. And they found one. It was very small and was the only one they could actually afford, but it was relatively close to both of their families and their work, so they took it. After getting the keys, Sandra and her mom would spend a very fun weekend going out to yard sales and discount stores to decorate and furnish the apartment, and by the time they were done, Sandra and Joe loved it. On June 11th, 1988, Sandra and Joe finally got married in front of all of their friends and family, and everyone seemed to have a great time, except for Jelka. Then, after the wedding, the new couple headed off to Hawaii for their honeymoon. A week later, Sandra and Joe returned to Vancouver, and when they walked into their new apartment, they were both shocked. The entire place had been completely redecorated. Couch covers had been switched out, the kitchen had been reorganized, bathrooms had different colored towels, the bed had different sheets on it, and it was even facing a different direction. After calling around to their families, they quickly discovered Yelka was responsible. She had used Joe's keys to slip into the apartment while they were on vacation. Sandra was furious. She and her mother had worked so hard to furnish and decorate the apartment to make it feel like her own, and now it just felt like Yelka's. It was so rude what she had done. Sandra literally couldn't believe it. Despite putting everything back the way it had been in their apartment, this was a massive violation of their privacy, and Sandra openly told Joe that she wanted nothing to do with his mother. However, it wasn't that simple for Joe. Despite her transgressions, Joe still loved his mom, and he got his paycheck from his mom. She was literally his boss at the auto body shop, so he couldn't just disown her, nor did he want to. This caused a lot of friction between the couple, but ultimately they just kind of accepted that they would need to find a way to live with Yelka and her intrusive behavior because she wasn't going anywhere. But despite Sandra's best efforts to put up with Yelka, Yelka made that nearly impossible on a regular basis. Shortly after the apartment redecorating incident, where afterwards Joe and Sandra told Yelka, "You cannot sneak into our apartment when we are gone," Yelka began sneaking into the couple's apartment when they were gone. Yelka had made a copy of her son's keys and just came and went as she pleased. At first, all she did was straighten things up around the apartment and periodically would go through their fridge, throwing away old food and sometimes replacing certain food items with other food items that she believed were better in some way. At first, Joe and Sandra actually didn't notice, but when it seemed like their entire fridge was starting to become full of food neither of them remembered purchasing, they confronted Yelka, and sure enough, she admitted to it. But the way she framed it was that she was simply swinging by and dropping off groceries. After this admission, privately, Sandra told Joe that he had to step in and stop Yelka from doing this. They had already told her, "You can't do this," and she's doing it all over again. And Joe, he would tell his wife, "Oh yeah, I'm going to tell her to stop, for sure." He actually would not. And so Yelka would just continue to come in and out of their apartment as she pleased. Sandra was furious and felt like she had totally lost control of the situation, but at the same time, she started having feelings that, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was wrong about Yelka, and she was just hypersensitive to what she was doing, and that in reality, Yelka was being really helpful. But when Yelka, during one of her secret apartment visits, removed half of Sandra's entire wardrobe from her closet and replaced it with clothing Yelka had bought, Sandra officially had had enough. Instead of waiting for Joe to come home that evening and to figure out what to do together, Sandra just hopped in her car and drove right over to her in-laws' house. When she arrived, she ran up the front steps. She didn't even knock on their door. She simply opened it and screamed at Yelka, who was straight ahead in the kitchen, that she can never come in their apartment without permission ever again. Then she screamed at Yelka to give her her clothing back immediately. Yelka seemed totally unfazed by this, and instead of saying sorry or trying to make an excuse, she just said very matter-of-factly, "You don't look good in your clothing. I know what you look good in." Then she walked over to a closet near the front door, pulled out several dresses and blouses and kind of chucked them at Sandra, and then holding her crumpled clothes in her arms, Sandra glared at Yelka for an extra second before turning and storming out of the house back to her car. When she got back to her apartment, Joe had come home at this point, so Sandra walked in and pretty much immediately laid into him. She explained how his mom had taken her clothes and that now she had just completely had it. She was done with Yelka. She can't come back in here. It's over. It's done. But while the couple fought, there was a knock on their front door. The couple stopped talking, and Joe stood up and walked over to the door, and he opened it. And shockingly, standing on the other side was Yelka and her husband, Sam. Sandra saw them and literally ran over and slammed the door in their face, but through the now shut door, she heard Yelka call out, "Please let us in. I have something very important I want to tell you." Sandra could sense that Yelka's tone seemed different somehow. Perhaps she was here to apologize. It certainly seemed possible given recent events. And so while holding the doorknob, Sandra turned and looked at Joe, who had a look of "I don't know what to do" on his face. And then with a very frustrated sigh, Sandra turned the doorknob and opened the front door again. And immediately, Yelka smiled at the couple and walked in like she owned the place. Sam followed behind her, but seemed wholly uninvested in whatever it was they were there for. Yelka strode right into the kitchen and she took a seat at the head of the table and then beckoned Sandra and Joe to come over and sit down as well. Sandra was already regretting her decision to let them in, but she did want to hear what Yelka had to say, and so she walked over and sat down, as did Joe. Once everyone was sitting around the table, Yelka smiled and said, "Sandra, Joe, we're going to make an $85,000 down payment on this beautiful 2-story house for you two to live in. We know this apartment is small and you want to start a family, and we want to give you the best home to do that in." Sandra and Joe were dumbstruck. They made very little money and had almost no savings, and so home ownership was not exactly on the horizon for them, although it was something they often fantasized about. But now, this fantasy could become a reality if they just said yes to Yelka. And so with Yelka sitting there staring at them intently with a big grin on her face, eagerly awaiting their answer, the couple exchanged a few quick glances at each other, kind of feeling each other out, and then they said, "Okay, yeah, thank you so much." Yelka was extremely pleased. She hugged them both and asked them to come by the property the next day to have a look around, and then Yelka and Sam got up and they left. That night, Sandra and Joe lay awake in bed talking about this incredible thing that had happened, and they came to the conclusion that Yelka must have been trying to make some sort of peace offering, that this was effectively a way for her to say sorry for what had transpired between them. And so by the time Sandra fell asleep that night, she was feeling very optimistic that her relationship with Yelka was about to improve. The following day, Sandra and Joe drove over to the house that they had just agreed to let Yelka and Sam put the down payment on, and right away, what stood out to Sandra was the home's proximity to Yelka's house. It was only about 5 minutes drive away, much closer than their current apartment was to Yelka's house. Also, as soon as Yelka arrived in her car and got out to talk to them on the sidewalk, she was absolutely brimming with excitement, talking about how she couldn't wait to start decorating the inside of the house. It was like she was moving into the house. Alarm bells were going off in Sandra's head. This arrangement clearly was a mistake. But at the same time, Sandra felt like they were in too deep. They had already agreed to do this. How could they possibly back out now? So against her better judgment, a few weeks later, the sale of this new house was finalized and Sandra and Joe moved in. But within a week of living there, everything fell apart. Sandra had mentioned to Joe that she wanted to put in a simple red accent tile along the back of the kitchen wall. Joe had apparently relayed this information to his mother, who promptly arrived at the house specifically to tell Sandra she wasn't allowed to do that Yelka already had plans for the kitchen. A massive fight broke out between the two women that ended with Sandra saying, "You know what? I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm moving in with my mom." Then Sandra did just that. She grabbed her things, put them in the car, and she left. Joe, who by now seemed to have just given up trying to keep the peace between his wife and his mother, didn't even try to stop her. It looked like Joe and Sandra's marriage was destined to fail. Yelka was just too much to overcome. But only a week after moving back in with her mother, Sandra started to feel nauseous. She took a pregnancy test and it revealed that she was pregnant. She was going to have Joe's baby. Sandra had a decision to make: return to Joe and by extension return to Yelka, or raise the child on her own. She called Joe to break the pregnancy news and talk about the way ahead for them, and he was extremely excited and begged her to come back and live in the house together again, and he promised he would keep his mother under control. By the end of the call, Sandra decided she was willing to go back and give it another shot, not because Joe was so convincing or that she thought Yelka was really going to change, but because she felt like she owed it to her unborn child. And much to Sandra's surprise, once she moved back into the house with Joe, it actually was much better than before. Namely because Yelka actually seemed to be giving them space. Clearly, Joe had laid down the law with her, and Yelka was respecting it. She gave them so much space that by the time Sandra actually gave birth to her son Brandon, she found herself secretly starting to kind of like Yelka, just a little bit. 6 months after Brandon was born, Sandra and Joe were both starting to feel very run down from being on baby duty 24/7, and so Joe suggested they go out on a date night that Friday. Sandra loved the idea and asked Joe to get them a babysitter, and then once he said he had, they made reservations for their favorite restaurant. When Friday came around, as Sandra was getting ready for the night, they heard the babysitter knock on the front door. Sandra opened the door and saw Yelka. Despite her recent good behavior, Sandra was still very much on edge, wondering when the old Yelka was going to come back out again. And so her immediate reaction to seeing Yelka on the other side of this door was, "What are you doing here?" Yelka looked at her funny and said, "I'm your babysitter. Joe asked me." Sandra immediately whipped her head around and looked at Joe, who was now standing very sheepishly in the middle of the room. Before Sandra could say anything to him, Yelka had slipped past her into the house and was already talking about how she and Brandon were going to have such a wonderful night together and that everything was going to be just fine. Sandra shut the door and then grabbed Joe and pulled him into another room and told him she didn't like this, that he should have told her he was going to have her babysit their son. But Joe told her she was overreacting, that, despite their past issues, his mom was really excellent with kids. This would be fine. Sandra did not like this, but eventually conceded. And then before the couple left, Sandra gave Yelka very specific instructions for how to care for Brandon, what to feed him, what time to put him to bed, etc. And the whole time, Yelka just reassured Sandra that it was going to be just fine. Just go out and have fun. Finally, after giving all the instructions she could possibly think of, Sandra and Joe said goodbye and they left. They went out to their favorite restaurant, and then afterwards they went to a club to go dancing. And as soon as they got there, Sandra stepped away and hopped on a payphone to call Yelka to make sure everything was going okay with their son. And when Yelka picked up, she informed Sandra that the boy was, quote, out like a light, because apparently she had given him some tea from the old country. Sandra said, "What? I told you he only takes breast milk. What did you give him?" And Yelka just laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. It's fine. He's asleep. Go enjoy yourself." Sandra was horrified. She hung up on Yelka and ran back into the club. She grabbed Joe and said, "Your mom just fed something to Brandon that she shouldn't have. We have to go." The two ran from the club. They hopped in the car, and then Sandra flew back to their house. As soon as they were parked outside, she ran up the steps into the house, right past Yelka, into her son's nursery. And then standing next to his crib, she reached down and she lifted him up, which should have woken him up, but it didn't. He just lay limp in her arms. And so immediately Sandra pressed his mouth up against her ear to see if he was still breathing, and barely she could tell he was still breathing. But despite screaming his name and moving him around, nothing was waking him up. And so by this point, Yelka had come into the room and she was trying to convince Sandra that this was no big deal, that, the tea from the old country works great. You got nothing to worry about. But at this point, Sandra is panicking and she's screaming at Yelka to tell her what was in the tea you gave him. But Yelka just wouldn't give her an answer. She just kept laughing and saying it was fine. And so finally, Sandra just takes her son and runs past Yelka, runs past Joe. She runs out to the car. She strapped her little boy into his car seat, and then she flew to the emergency room. And then when she got there, she hopped out. She's carrying her baby. She's hysterically crying. And she runs in through the doors, and all the doctors and nurses, they run over and they take the child from her, and they're asking all these questions. They're trying to figure out what's going on, and they start feeling for a pulse, and they would find one. However, it was very, very slow. And so they whisked Brandon away into an exam room to work on him and figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Sandra just had to pace in the waiting room, crying hysterically, having no idea what's happening to her boy. But luckily, just a few minutes later, one of the doctors would come back out of the exam room and they would tell Sandra that, we think your son's going to be just fine. We don't know what he consumed, but whatever it was not good, and he should never have that again. And then he told Sandra she could come back and actually be with her son again. And so Sandra left the waiting room and she went down the hall. She went into the room where her son was. And there, laying on this bed with wires and tubes connected to him, is her little boy, who still looks totally lifeless. And so Sandra walked around and she sat down next to the bed and she laid her head down on the pillow and just looked at her son. And right there, in that moment, she decided that she was officially done with Yelka, even if it meant being done with Joe. A few minutes later, when Joe arrived by himself, Sandra would tell him he needed to choose. It was either going to be her or his mother. Unlike other times, Joe was not quick to come to his wife's side. In his mind, Sandra had become as much to blame for the drama as his mother was. And so after getting very frustrated with Sandra, he said, "You know what? You keep yelling at my mom, and I don't like it. She only wants to help and be supportive, and you just can't accept that. So I'm sorry, but I'm choosing my mom, not you." And Sandra would say, "Fine." And then the two of them just sat in silence on opposite sides of their son for the next hour until the doctors came back in and gave them the okay to take their son home, at which point Sandra immediately stood up and grabbed Brandon, and she and her son left the hospital without another word to Joe. She would drive her son to her mother's house and drop him off with her parents, and then she would go back to Joe's house, collect most of her things, and then move into her mom's house with her son. The following day, she would file for divorce. Immediately, the divorce became very nasty. Sandra didn't want Brandon anywhere near Jelka, so she decided to seek full custody of him. However, Joe, who by this point had gone from being something of an innocent bystander caught in the middle of two people he loved, to being aggressively on his mother's side, and therefore aggressively opposed to Sandra, told Sandra that he would be seeking full custody of Brandon as well. While these legal proceedings were going on, Joe's parents took it upon themselves to change all the locks of the house, knowing some of Sandra's things were still tucked away in the attic. Jelka also had their lawyer send Sandra a letter explaining that she was now forbidden from stepping foot inside of that house without express permission from Jelka. But as Joe and his mother made these punitive moves, Sandra would receive a huge legal break. The judge in their case had come to a decision. Sandra would get full custody of Brandon, and Joe would be required to pay child support and an alimony payment. The judge also ruled that Sandra would get primary ownership status of the house that Jelka had put the down payment on, and on top of all of that, based on Jelka's previous behavior, she was forbidden from having any contact with both Sandra and Brandon. Joe and his family were beyond outraged, but their only recourse was to be on their best behavior and try to file an appeal and have the judge change the ruling. So in the meantime, Joe very reluctantly and bitterly moved out of the house, and then Sandra and Brandon moved back in. Over the following few months, Joe didn't pay a dime of child support or alimony payments to Sandra. He also didn't bother to try to get in touch about seeing his son. Sandra was very upset about this. However, she was mostly just upset for her son, whose father basically had abandoned him. But as the silence between them grew, Sandra started to think to herself that maybe it was for the best. Fast forward about a year and a half to the summer of 1992, Joe was still not paying any support money to Sandra, and he and Sandra were still not talking, minus during court appearances for the appeals that had been filed. And during those short interactions, Joe would be openly cold and hateful toward his ex-wife, which Sandra could clearly tell made Jelka very happy. But Sandra didn't care. She had her son, she had the house, and she felt like no matter what they said or they did, they weren't going to stop her from trying to have the best life she could have. But Sandra's life was about to take a drastic and unexpected turn. In June of that year, Sandra walked out to her mailbox in the morning and found a small package with no return address on it. She brought the package inside, opened it up, and saw that it contained a paperback novel called The Deaths of Cindy James. It was a non-fiction account of a woman named Cindy James, who for years had been harassed by some unknown person who ultimately killed her and got away with it. Sandra's first thought when she saw this book was that, maybe she had accidentally signed up for a book club or something. And so she just put the book on the table and went about her day. That evening, after work, she saw the book on the table and just picked it up and sat down and began flipping through the pages for the first time. And right away, she noticed someone had underlined several passages in the book. When Sandra began reading these highlighted sections in the book, she started to feel very uncomfortable. All the highlighted sections were descriptions of the specific awful things that had happened to Cindy. Namely, her tree in her front yard had been lit on fire. She started getting threatening phone calls at all hours of the night. Strangers would lurk on her property. Cars followed her around when she was out in town. And then the last underlined passage was about Cindy's death, and only 2 words were underlined: "You're dead." Sandra didn't know what to make of this book, but it definitely felt threatening. She assumed Joe had sent it just to be cruel. 2 days later, Sandra was sitting in her living room with a friend when they both suddenly heard a strange sound coming from the outside of the front of her house. All of the windows that looked into the front yard had the curtains drawn, and so Sandra and her friend stood up and walked over and pulled one of the curtains aside, and right in the middle of the front of her property on her front lawn, her tree was on fire, just like the Cindy James book. In fact, as soon as Sandra saw this, she handed Brandon to her friend and she ran into the kitchen and she grabbed the book, the Cindy James book, and she ran back and she flipped through the pages and she found the passage about the tree and she showed it to her friend and she said, "Look, someone sent me this 2 days ago and now they're doing what's happening in the book to me." Sandra would call the fire department and the police department and they would all show up and they would put the fire out. And then afterwards, Sandra would speak to the officers and she would explain the situation about her divorce and how she'd received this book. But the police didn't have much they could do. Even if Joe had done this, there was no proof. So they just told her to, be vigilant and report anything strange you see. And if you call us, we'll come out immediately. Over the following weeks, a man started calling Sandra's house in the middle of the night. He never said anything. He just breathed into the phone. The calls became so frequent that Sandra had to disconnect her phone at night just so she and Brandon could sleep. She would tell the police about the calls, but again, there was just nothing they could do. About a month after the calls had begun, Sandra was giving her son a bath in their house, and after he was all clean, she scooped him up in a towel and she carried him across the hall into his room, which was on the first floor in the back of the house. And when she walked into his room, the light was off, so it's totally dark, and the curtains that covered the back window were actually pulled to the side, revealing a clear view into the backyard. And standing right on the outside of her house, looking into her son's window, is this large man with a ski mask on. And he can clearly see that Sandra is looking at him, but he's totally unfazed. In fact, when he can tell that Sandra has made eye contact with him, he leans forward into the glass before turning and walking out of sight. Sandra immediately runs all over her house, making sure all the doors are locked. And then as she's reconnecting her phone to call 911, she hears banging on windows and she hears banging on the walls. And then by the time the police show up, there's no sign that anybody was there. And so once again, the police had to say to her, "Sorry, you're on your own." The next day, when Sandra noticed a car was now clearly following her in town, she realized all of the underlined sections of the Cindy James book had now happened to her in real life, except for one, the last underlined section, the one where Cindy dies. Scared for her life, Sandra hired a private investigator to both watch her home and try to figure out who was behind this. But after a couple of weeks, the nightly calls and occasional footsteps outside of her windows at night continued, and the private detective had gotten no closer to figuring out who was behind this. However, he did tell Sandra that he had been following Joe around and watching him and his family, and they all appeared to just be living a normal life. On the afternoon of August 5th of that year, so 2 months after receiving the Cindy James book in the mail, Sandra walked out of her dental office with her coworker Bernice. That day, Sandra was supposed to give Bernice a ride home. So the pair walked across the parking lot to the road where Sandra's car was parked. Sandra hopped in the driver's seat and fired up the engine, while Bernice hopped in the passenger seat and bent down to shove her bag underneath the seat below her. As Bernice was bent down, she suddenly heard gunfire on her left. She screamed and stayed bent forward, gripping the back of her head to protect herself, and then when the shooting stopped, Bernice sat up and looked out the front window and she saw a red car speeding away from them. Then she turned to look at Sandra and she saw her coworker was slumped forward. 2 of the 6 shots that had been fired from that red car had struck Sandra in the head. Bernice ran out of the car and she got help, and before long the police and paramedics were there, but by the time they reached Sandra, it was too late. She was already deceased. After her death, the police immediately turned their attention to Joe as their primary suspect. However, despite showing no emotion when he was told the mother of his child had just been murdered, he did have a rock-solid alibi. He had been at a public swimming pool during the shooting and even had a receipt to prove it. But the police just weren't buying it. Something seemed off about him. So they began staking out Joe's parents' house, which is where he was living at the time, watching to see what Joe did and who he talked to. And for the first 4 days, nothing unusual happened. But on the 5th day, the police were watching the house from a distance when Yelka suddenly came out the front door and hopped in her car and started to back down her driveway. But before she reached the end of the driveway, she came to a stop. Then a man came running out of her house who was neither Joe nor her husband, and he climbed into the back seat of her car and then laid down on the floorboards so no one could see him. The police thought this was very odd, so they decided to trail Yelka. They would follow her to a nearby mall parking garage where she and this man would climb out of the vehicle and go into the mall at different times as if they were trying to make it seem like they didn't know each other. One of the officers would stay in the parking garage watching Yelka's car, while the other officer went into the mall to see what these two were up to. But very quickly, that officer lost sight of both Yelka and this man, and so he had to return back to the parking garage with his partner. A little while later, the two officers watched as Yelka returned to her car, and then a few moments later, so too did this man, who promptly climbed back into her car and got down on the floorboards out of sight again. The police would trail Yelka back to her house, where as soon as she parked in the driveway, the man in the back climbed out and walked to the front of the property, hopped in a parked car, and drove off. The police followed this man and pulled him over less than a mile away, and when he got out of the car, something fell out of his pocket that blew the case wide open. It would turn out Joe really hadn't been involved in what happened to Sandra. However, his mother Yelka had. She had grown to hate Sandra so much she had decided she wanted to get rid of her, and she had just the plan in mind. Yelka was obsessed with the story of Cindy James, and so she decided she would force Sandra to relive Cindy's nightmare all the way to its grisly conclusion. After doing some digging, Yelka discovered one of her family friends, a man named MrBallen Podcast, had connections to a hitman named David Segoviano. David was really just a seedy criminal willing to do just about anything for money. Yelka instantly told MrBallen to hire David to take out Sandra. However, she stressed that David had to first carry out all the underlined segments of the Cindy James book before he shot her down. Because Yelka didn't just want to kill Sandra, she wanted to torture her first. MrBallen Podcast was the man who was hiding in Yelka's car. The two had driven to that mall so that Yelka could take $30,000 in cash out of a bank that she was paying to MrBallen for organizing the hit. And then MrBallen was going to take a portion of that and pay it to David, the shooter. And so when MrBallen got pulled over by police, when he stood up, the cash that he had been paid by Yelka was jammed in his pockets. And so literally he stood up and hundreds of dollars began falling out of his pockets. And very quickly the police were able to figure out what it was for. Less than a year later, Yelka, MrBallen, and David were tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Pesek. They were all given the maximum sentence for first-degree murder in Canada, which is 25 years. Joe Pesek was never charged with a crime. As for Sandra's son, he would go on to be raised by Sandra.
On December 7th, 1993, a pregnant woman named Diane Schaap sat inside of a hospital room in the city of Fulda, Germany, staring anxiously at the nurse who was doing her blood pressure. When the nurse was done, she would tell Diane that her blood pressure was still too high. And so Diane, she sighed and she was pretty upset by this. But at the same time, she wasn't all that shocked. After all, Diane had come to the hospital because she thought something was wrong with her. Diane was an American who lived on the nearby Sickles Army Airfield Base along with her husband, Sergeant Stephen Schaap. And that morning, Diane had begun to bleed, and because she had a history of miscarriages, she panicked and just rushed to the hospital to get checked out. Now, ultimately, the doctors would tell her that it seemed like she was going to be okay and that the bleeding was not a big issue. But as a precaution, they wanted her to stay in the hospital for a week, just doing bed rest, where they could watch her and make sure she was really okay. And so far, she was, but her blood pressure was still too high. The nurse who had taken Diane's blood pressure finished doing the rest of Diane's vitals, and then afterwards, she left the room, leaving Diane alone. And Diane, now, it's the first time she's been alone inside of her hospital room since she arrived, and suddenly she just felt so anxious about the whole situation. And so as she's laying in her bed, wondering if her pregnancy was really okay, she heard footsteps out in the hallway, and then suddenly her door busted open, and it was her husband, Stephen. And Stephen, his skin was pale, his eyes were red, he looked really upset, and he rushed into the room and he kneeled down next to Diane's bed and he took her hand and he just said, how are you doing? It had been a really hard stretch lately for Diane and Stephen. Just a few months earlier, Diane had actually asked Stephen for a divorce because she felt like Stephen had grown distant and the love was just not there anymore in their relationship. As for Stephen, he didn't want the divorce. He felt like the relationship was still good, they still loved each other, But he understood Diane was clearly unhappy, and so he was very gentlemanly about this whole situation, and even went with Diane to the base's cleric, where they arranged for Diane to be sent back to the United States while Stephen stayed in Germany. But before Diane was able to make that move back home, she had discovered that she was pregnant. Now, Diane knew Stephen really wanted to reconcile and get back together, and especially now that he had found out she was pregnant, he really wanted them to get back together so he could be the dad. But Diane knew that just was not possible. Their relationship just didn't work. And so she needed to be firm. And so she actually squeezed Stephen's hand as he's sitting there right next to her. And she just said to him, even though he hadn't brought it up, she said, we can't get back together, even though I'm pregnant. It can't happen. But Stephen just kind of shook his head at her like he was not here for that reason. And he said, look, I just want to be your friend. Let me go back to your house. I'll gather up your things and bring them here to make your stay a little bit more comfortable. And so Diane, who wanted to tell Stephen, no, don't do that. I'm fine. She could just tell that he really wanted to help her. And so kind of against her better judgment, Diane said, okay, Stephen, if you want to go back and get my stuff, I would really appreciate it. And at that, Stephen stood up and he gave Diane a long hug and said, I'll be right back. And then he turned and left the room. A few hours later, at around 5 p.m. that evening, the phone inside of Diane's room began to ring. And so Diane answered it, and it was her husband's best friend, Gregory Glover. And he was calling just to check in on Diane because he had heard she was in the hospital about some bleeding, and he wanted to make sure the baby was okay. And Diane would tell him that, it seems like everything's fine. And then after that, Gregory would tell Diane that he was really worried about Stephen. He said, this morning I had driven him to work, and all he did was pour his heart out to me about how he wanted to get back together with you. And I just want you to know that, he's really worked up about this. But before Diane could even respond to Gregory, the phone just suddenly went dead. And so Diane, she held the phone out, kind of staring at it like, what's going on here? She put it back to her ear. She said Greg's name a few more times, but the line was just totally dead. And so Diane, she hung up the phone and figured Gregory would just call back. But 30 minutes went by and Gregory did not call back. And then out in the hallway, Diane began to hear running. And that running continued all the way up the hall and it stopped right outside of her door. And so she turned to face her door, the door flung open, and what she saw caused Diane to just freeze in total shock. A few hours earlier, after Stephen had left Diane's hospital room, he had gone straight to her house to begin gathering things up for her. And so when he got there, he had a gym bag, which was made by a sports and athletic company called Head, and he had gone inside of her house and begun going around the rooms, gathering things she would want, and putting them in this bag. And at some point, Stephen made his way into Diane's bedroom, and suddenly he was just kind of overcome with sadness because he looked around the room and he saw there were still pictures up from their wedding day, and there was a card that was face down on the bedside table that he recognized. And just all of these different things he was seeing just suddenly made him feel so depressed about losing his marriage. And so Stephen, instead of continuing to gather up things for Diane, he just began pacing back and forth inside of her bedroom, thinking about ways he could potentially win Diane back. Maybe there was a gift he could give her or some sort of offering or gesture that would show her that he still loved her very much. And so as Stephen was thinking about this, he happened to glance down at his gym bag, and suddenly he felt totally inspired, like he knew exactly what he needed to do. And so without another thought, Stephen grabbed something off of the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom, he threw it inside of his gym bag, then he grabbed the bag and walked out of her house. Once Stephen was outside, he had a big smile on his face, he was even whistling as he walked, and he went down and he got into his car and he drove off. But instead of going to the hospital where Diane was, Stephen began driving in these weird loops all around Sickles Army Airfield Base, almost like he was going on a joyride. But as he was driving, Stephen was constantly scanning left and right, like he was looking for something. And then at some point, as he did one of his many loops, Stephen passed by the mess hall, the cafeteria, and he saw all the soldiers going in and out of this mess hall, and he thought, oh, that's where it will be. The thing I need is inside of there. And so Stephen, he parked his car, he got out, and he rushed inside of the mess hall. But after looking all around, he couldn't find the thing he wanted. And so frustrated, he turned and walked out of the mess hall. But when he went back outside, as he was walking back to his car, something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he looked over, and it was this phone booth right on the sidewalk up against the road. And he couldn't believe it, but there it was. There was the thing right near this phone booth that Stephen desperately wanted. And so Stephen, instead of going to his car, just began walking in a straight, very determined line towards this phone booth. 30 minutes later, Diane heard those running footsteps out in the hallway, and then her door flung open and she froze in shock at what she saw. Because what she saw was her husband, and he had this totally crazed look on his face, like he was smiling, but kind of deranged, and he was holding that head gym bag. And he walked in holding the bag and just stared directly at Diane, and then he opened it up, he reached inside, and he pulled out his special gift, the thing he had been driving all around base for that he had found inside of that phone booth, and he walked up to Diane, and he put it right in her face and said, look what I brought you, look! And by this point, Diane was screaming bloody murder. It would turn out, when Stephen first arrived at Diane's hospital room that morning, and he had knelt down and taken her hand and asked if she was okay, Diane had been very firm with him that they could still not get back together, even though she was pregnant. Now, this was crushing news for Stephen because he did secretly hope that this baby would bring them back together, but what Diane told Stephen next was infinitely more crushing. She would say to Stephen that the real reason they could not get back together was because this baby was not his. Now, Stephen had initially taken this news pretty well and said to Diane, okay, I understand, at least let me go to your house and gather up some things for you and bring them back here so your stay at the hospital is a little bit more comfortable. And Diane had maybe been a little bit surprised at how well Stephen had taken this, and she said, okay, yeah, that would be great. And so Stephen had left the hospital, gone to Diane's house, he went into her room, and he began putting her things into that gym bag when suddenly he stopped because he noticed those pictures on the mantelpiece of their wedding day, and it was just kind of crushing to realize that his marriage really was over. And then, before he went back to packing, he happened to glance over at the bedside table, and he noticed a card face down on that table. Now, at first, Stephen actually didn't really react to this card because he knew who had given it to Diane. It was just a friend of hers, and the card was kind of meaningless. It was just a card to celebrate their friendship. But then Stephen's suddenly thinking to himself, wait a minute. This person, this friend of Diane's, gives her cards all the time. And this person is always coming over to say hi to Diane. And this person's always complimenting Diane and telling me how great Diane is. And it was like suddenly everything just kind of fell into place for Stephen, and he realized this so-called friend of Diane's was much more than that. This friend was Diane's lover and very likely the father of her unborn child. And who was this friend of Diane's? Well, none other than Stephen's very best friend, Gregory Glover. The same Gregory Glover that Stephen just that morning had poured his heart out to on the ride to work, telling Gregory how much he missed his wife and how much he wanted to reconcile. And Gregory's advice to Stephen had been, well, I know you're hurting, but you really need to let this go. You need to let the divorce happen and just move on with your life. And now Stephen realized that Gregory wanted Stephen to end his relationship with his wife so Gregory could have a relationship with Diane. And so Stephen felt unbelievably betrayed, and that was when he decided to get a gift for Diane. And so he grabbed a knife that was on the mantelpiece inside of Diane's bedroom. He threw it inside of his gym bag. He got in his car and he began driving around the base looking for Gregory. And after Stephen had gone into the mess hall and then come back out again, he had spotted Gregory on the phone inside of that phone booth. And Stephen had immediately run over, opened it up, grabbed Gregory, pulled him out, and begun stabbing him. Now, Stephen didn't know this, but at the time he attacked Greg was literally on the phone with Diane. And so when that call suddenly dropped and Diane expected Gregory to call her back, well, their call really hadn't dropped. It was just that Gregory had been pulled away and was being attacked. Gregory, who was totally caught off guard, tried his best to defend himself against Stephen, but Stephen was just crazed and he kept hacking away until finally Gregory had stopped moving. And then at some point, Stephen stood up and kind of caught his breath, and he's looking around at all these onlookers who can't believe what they're seeing. And Stephen said, I'm sorry. He grabbed some things off the ground, put them inside of his head bag, and then he took the bag, he ran to his car, drove to the hospital, ran through the hospital to Diane's room. He flung the door open, and Diane is shocked to see him. and Stephen walks in with this crazed look on his face, and he holds up the bag, he unzips it, and pulls out Gregory's severed head. And he holds it right in front of Diane and says, look what I brought you, look! And he placed it down right on the bedside table, looking directly at Diane. And so Diane began screaming, and people began rushing into the room. Meanwhile, Stephen just sat in the corner calmly, waiting to be arrested. Ultimately, Stephen would be tried by a military court, and he would be sentenced to life in prison.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Snowball Effect.
On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a very special occasion for Moon because she had been dating Lee for several months now, and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled, because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good-looking, he was very well-educated, and he came from a family that was extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the total package that any parent would be psyched that their daughter was dating. After Moon and Lee had been sitting at this table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door. And so Moon, she stood up and she waved to her parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee. And right away, Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was talking to Moon's mother and showing her pictures of his dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least 2 hours, just enjoying each other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back and telling him how great he was. And Lee was doing the same thing to the parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents. And here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage, which ended with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over. And then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car being totally shocked at what had just happened. And then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home. And then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long, because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it up, there was a delivery guy with this huge, beautiful bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what? I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. My parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, stop buying me stuff. It's fine. I totally forgive you. Everything is good. But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates. And so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog, because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day for right now. And probably it has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment. And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door. But before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, she swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned. But instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off. And the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of, with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment, Moon once again yelled out for Lee in hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at, but Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't, and so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. She was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses, and she's feeling super uneasy, but she thought, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to... It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up that closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any money. He basically just borrowed money from family and friends and then lied about how he acquired the money, claiming he was this big, successful, wealthy guy. Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, by this point, police had located the cell phone of a missing woman amongst Lee's things, and so they became very suspicious that he might have had something to do with this 3rd woman's disappearance. However, to this day, Lee has denied having anything to do with this missing woman, and they still have no idea what happened to her. And so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all over the news, Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him. And the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive. He looks like an actor. Not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way. That maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those 2 murders.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen.